Great, okay. Great, thanks, Aisha. So I'm very excited to introduce today's brown bag speakers. So first I'll introduce Nick Graetz, who's a demographer and sociologist studying the political economy of housing and population health. He received his PhD in demography at the University of Pennsylvania in 2021, writing a dissertation on the role of place in producing social stratification. He is now a postdoctoral research associate at the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. His substantive research focuses on structural racism, housing inequality, political economy, population health, with methodological interests in causal inference, mediation, decomposition analysis, and Bayesian small area estimation. He also attended the 2019 Berkeley Formal Demography Workshop. Professor Daniel Aldana Cohen is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. At Berkeley, he directs the Socio-Climate Collaborative, or SC2, and is a faculty affiliate of the graduate program on political economy. Professor Cohen works on the intersection of climate emergency, housing, political economy, social movements, and inequalities of race and class in the United States and Brazil. He is co-author of Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and has a new book under contract with Princeton Press, Street Fight, Climate Change, and Inequality in the 21st Century City. Today, they will be presenting on American Eco-Apartheid Mapping Racial Disparities in Longevity Driven by Political Economy, State Violence, and Environmental Exposure. Please join me in welcoming Nick.
Great. All right, I'm going to send up here. Thank you so much, everyone. So Nick is going to be wielding the slides. I'll ask him to pass on to the next slide, but Nick will also be talking for most of the time. I'm going to kick us off, and I'll come back in a minute. We're presenting a paper that's under review, part of a larger set of concerns that we're working on. If anyone would like to see the paper, you can just send me an email, of course. There are 4 authors on the paper, Nick and I, as well as Seth Prinz and Michael Esposito. Nick and I are the ones presenting, of course. And this is a kind of offshoot, in a sense, of a broader project on data fusion called Fusion ACS, which again, we can talk about more later. So the plan of the talk, that says, oh yeah, next slide. Excuse the typo, it's a plan of the talk. Despite the eco theme, no plans. I'm going to give some background for the motivation for the paper. I'm going to define what we mean by eco-apartheid. I'm going to pass it over to Nick, who's going to deliver a critique of prevailing vulnerability indices connected to some discourses in public health research. We're going to both talk about how our work builds on the strengths of American apartheid or redlining research and environmental justice research. I'm going to talk about how we've constructed the index, and Nick will take us through results, discussion, and policy implications. Slide. Where this comes from is the sense that we need a synthetic framework to talk about 2 really big convergent crises, the climate emergency and inequalities. There are many kinds of inequalities, in particular inequalities of race and class. We think politically, intellectually, scientifically, it is essential to be able to talk about these big emergencies that are coinciding together. So we think we need a framework that has theory, that has quantitative support, that can capture the convergence of these crises. And in this paper, we're aiming for something that is at once holistic and parsimonious, classic challenge, that is consistent with the best theory and history, even though that won't necessarily be captured in the index. It's not a causal index, but we want it to be consistent with theory and history. And we want to generate a framework that is useful to policymakers. We've got to do something about these massive problems. Next slide. We're engaging with the kind of surging use of the apartheid analogy. Of course, Massey and Denton made this famous in their book on American apartheid, but we're seeing more and more use of apartheid as a phrase to kind of characterize the world we live in, and more on that in a second. We also really want to take on a kind of basic fundamental definition of structural racism that we get from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, a radical geographer. She defines structural racism as the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So there's a lot there, and she's written a lot. But I think what we're taking out of this is this difference in longevity as a key marker of inequality and of racialized inequality. And of course, the role of the state and state violence in making this happen. And we're also getting into this neighborhood level research where we're seeing very intense neighborhood level variation of longevity in the United States, just to take the United States, And most of that longevity, that difference in longevity cannot be explained by averages at the national level, at the county level, at the state level. So we need that fine-grained geospatial analysis. And we need it because we see differences in the order of 10, 20, 30 years in life expectancy at the 3 census tracts in a single neighborhood. So we're kind of trying to take all this on. As I mentioned, there's a classic Maxine Denton book on American apartheid. This represents a stream of research on apartheid that tends to really focus on segregation, but in our view leaves out some of the other features of apartheid we know from South Africa. Political economy, labor market structure, and of course, state violence. We see the surge of kind of use of the term climate apartheid, especially coming out of the United Nations. And I and others have been writing about eco-apartheid. Although I would say at this point, there is no kind of standard definition of eco-apartheid or kind of canonical text. That's part of what we're trying to do. We use the term eco-apartheid rather than climate because we want to situate this crisis in a longer history. The history of the climate emergency is the history of colonialism and racism. Slide ahead. Sorry about that. And then one more slide. Kind of lost track here. This multi. Okay. So this is a long history. So we want to situate the current moment in that longer environmental, economic, political history. Again, we want to get beyond a view of apartheid that is just focused on segregation and also think about political economy and state violence, in addition, of course, to racism and to environmental exposure. I am writing a kind of more theoretical, historical short book called Democracy and Eco-Apartheid with Norton. And so that is a kind of bigger project where we go beyond the United States. And then in this collaborative project, we're really drilling in on the US. Next slide. We define eco-apartheid as a confluence of historically developed, geographically uneven socio-environmental systems and processes that produce racialized spatial concentrations of political economic inequality, state violence, and environmental vulnerability. Together, this causes premature death among Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we really want to focus on public and private sector activities, capitalist economic relations, bureaucratic violence, police violence, and the unequal exposure to environmental harms as driving inequality. And this is a big mouthful, but what we're trying to do here is not define eco-apartheid in terms of the people who suffer most from it, which can be a problem in some social science, conflating the process with the victims, but we want to think about a big holistic process that produces this outcome. And then the index proper, which we'll be talking about, we're trying to take on the flaws of prevailing vulnerability indices by building on the strengths of research on segregation and research on environmental racism. So let me turn it over to Nick to dig into the next part of our presentation.
Cool. Can you guys hear me all right over there?
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. Do you mind, Casey, do you mind muting it on your guys' sound? I feel like I'm hearing my own voice like through the...
Can you mute?
If I mute
the owl, then it just means that.
Oh yeah, that's great. Cool, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Before getting to the construction of our index Daniel just talked about, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how different spatial indices have been used in public health research. So, as I think this audience knows, there's tons of theories of disease distribution that have been developed over the course of centuries, which focus on the social and economic production of disease, dating back to Engels' classic, The Condition of the Working Class in England, and the work of people like W.B. Du Bois. But the dominant narrative in the United States for the past 40 years in public media, policy, and much of academia has been really one of biomedical innovation and health behaviors. So we've seen this clearly throughout the course of the pandemic in the United States, where disease control has focused almost exclusively on vaccine development and individual responsibility. We see this in the funding priorities of annual grant disbursements from the NIH. And we see this in the elevation of certain voices in the discourse around COVID-19 in a news media which focuses heavily on individualism. And historians of public health note how this is in part tied to how public health has navigated the huge neoliberal shift in the United States as health became further privatized and decentralized and public funding for research shifted. But this has come at the cost of abandoning in some ways some of the core principles of the work, like from people like Engels and Du Bois, that the distribution of disease is ultimately a social mirror turned towards the distribution of power in a society, often along the spatial lines of race and class. But there's also been a very particular mainstreaming of a different theory of disease distribution, which is often referred to as the social determinants of health. And these explanations use characteristics such as income and education to predict health outcomes, often leaving a couple things very vague. So one is the relation connecting these individualized characteristics to health and the systems distributing these individualized characteristics in the first place. So in other words, these accounts are often siloed and static rather than dynamic and relational, orienting something like socioeconomic status as an individual trait rather than created and maintained through racialized social relations. Yet these explanations are positioned as the primary foil to that sole focus on biomedical and behavioral explanations. And so what happens is these explanations underpin common indices used to describe the spatial distribution of health, such as the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. And so this index has been widely used to draw attention to health disparities, especially during COVID-19, usually in a way that situates the concept of vulnerability within the individual, rather than focusing on the policies and social relations, which themselves distribute health risks and privileges and give them meaning. And again, doing so risks straying further from the collective principles that have been emphasized for decades as public health has undergone this kind of neoliberal shift. So rather than fit social conditions into a framework of risk factors that situates vulnerability in the individual, we should focus instead on the systems of power which distribute and maintain vulnerability to poor health in a way that's historical and relational, as Daniel was talking about. So here we try to demonstrate one index that is based on relational measures with different implications than common indices like the SBI, by building on the strengths of historical and environmental justice frameworks, while also addressing some of their weaknesses. But this kind of social determinants framework is very entrenched and still leads to often static and deterministic interpretations of things. So I think a primary example is the recent use of Hulk redlining maps in health research. So interest in something like redlining has grown in recent years, fueled in part by the color of law and also the digitizing of all the Hulk maps by Richmond's Mapping and Equality Project. And so how could we think about tracing the influence of these maps and what they represent on contemporary racialized health outcomes? So we might think of one theory as so-called spatial marking, which really captures this idea that redline status entrenched racist logics about a particular place, leading to decades of durable disinvestment and exploitation based on the racialization of place-based investment risk. And I think this is the intuitive theory of redlining that most quantitative studies implicitly lean on, especially in considering the Hulk maps. And this is what we've seen in the burgeoning research in population health using these digitized maps. There's been a proliferation of really important work demonstrating that neighborhoods graded as D generally have worse health outcomes than neighborhoods graded as A. And this work relies on this spatial marking perspective to theorize the impact of Hulk grades across particular places, either because they were specifically marked by Hulk or because Hulk reflected the prevailing marking of those neighborhoods at the time. But still, is the effect of something like redlining more complicated than that? This one-to-one comparison of contemporary neighborhoods to their area-based grade in the 1930s. For example, lots of majority Black working class neighborhoods today were never graded as D, yet we can observe the same massive racialized health disparities across these places. And certainly this is built out of the same history of this racist logic of redlining, even if that particular neighborhood was not graded as D. And so historians and sociologists treat these Hulk maps more holistically within this perspective of racial capitalism, and what these maps really represented more broadly about this era of American history. And that's the perspective we're trying to bring in here a bit more. These perspectives focus on redlining as the racist construction and management of financial risk within a public-private partnerships across Hulk, the Federal Housing Administration, and private real estate, all with the specific goal of capital accumulation. And indeed, these are often the same specific individuals moving between these different sectors. And so in this perspective, the effect of redlining was less about was this tract graded as D, and more about legitimizing ideas of race, place, and objective land and property value. And importantly, over the decades following the end of legal state-sanctioned redlining and the Fair Housing Act, this racist logic of capital accumulation within the private housing market proliferated far beyond mortgage denials for specific degraded neighborhoods. For example, the work of people like Howell and Corver Glenn show that conditional on property characteristics, racial composition continues to be a stronger and stronger determinant of home value in the decades following the Fair Housing Act, especially as capital shifted from manufacturing to real estate, which is now really the dominant circuit of the global financial economy. And again, the lasting legacy of redlining in this example is perhaps not the grades themselves via the spatial marking of particular neighborhoods, but rather codifying a system of property valuation and risk through these public-private partnerships, which should be reflected in our contemporary analysis of inequality. So Daniel's going to talk about this a little bit more in the context of the environmental justice literature.
Great. Okay, thank you, Nick. Let's go to the next slide. So as Nick is pointing out, we're drawing very heavily on the work on the history of redlining, on segregation, but some skepticism of the ongoing use of maps from the 1930s as a proxy for racial capitalism and racial inequality today. When we get to environmental justice, here again, we are building on a rich tradition of literature now, and what the environmental justice literature has fundamentally shown is that communities of color, and in particular Black communities in the United States, have been very disproportionately exposed to environmental contaminants. So above and beyond cost, racialized exposure, unequal racialized exposure to environmental pollution. This is a major, major finding that is reproduced over and over. Next slide, Nick. Building on that finding, there has been a proliferation of quantitative work, which is about generating environmental justice indices or environmental injustice indices. A lot of that work coming out of from brilliant research here at Berkeley, led often by Relational Frosch. And next slide, please. What this work does is it constructs indices that kind of combine social and demographic factors and environmental factors to create a joint score of socio-environmental exposure. As you can see here are some of the social and health vulnerability characteristics that are in the paper that I had just shown before. That's been quite influential in California. And as somewhat similar to what we saw with the social vulnerability index, these are essentially measurements of unequal outcomes. So, and unequal outcomes that may be contingent. So the social vulnerability index includes living in a multifamily home as a marker of vulnerability. Of course, many affluent urban professionals today want to live in such homes. This environmental injustice screening tool will include things like percent people of color. But of course, this can be ultimately problematic, and that our goal is to break the link between the percentage of a neighborhood that is not classed as white and any kind of health outcome, right? So right now, again, in environmental justice work as well, we see these indices of inequality that focus on characteristics that wouldn't necessarily be the characteristics that are kind of causes in the terms of power relations, causes of inequality. Next slide.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite understanding this point.
So the idea is that if we say a neighborhood is a site of injustice because it has a high percentage of Black residents, what happens in 20 years? Can you continue to use that index? And also, what does that index tell us? There is a threat that that index ultimately conflates the outcomes with the causal mechanisms we want to think about. So I would suggest we just talk about this more at the end, because this is a big idea. Okay, I'm just going to move on and let's discuss this further then. We have in environmental justice work now a surge of work on redlining, environmental exposure, and also things like associations of redlining and outdoor heat, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Next slide. These indices are very important. In California, we have something called Cal-Enviro Screen. New York State is developing its own version. The Biden administration is going to develop something called the Justice 40. And essentially, these screening tools are now going to guide billions and billions of dollars of investment. The policy framework is we use these indices to identify the most disadvantaged communities by multiplying together social and environmental vulnerabilities, and then we will direct disproportionate investment to them. So that's something I support. Nick and I have just co-authored a white paper on this topic, but just to give you a sense, the stakes are high. Next slide. But as Nick was describing with redlining, we also want to build on the historical and theoretical work in the environmental justice tradition, which which has a sophisticated account of the ways that power structures in society steer investment in certain ways that yield more polluting impacts on communities of color. And increasingly, and this is a recent book by David Pello, who's at UC Santa Barbara, increasingly thinking about the links between policing, mass incarceration, police violence, and environmental injustice. And we take this on in our index. Next slide. Okay, so finally, our index. So we've constructed an index of just 6 measures, far fewer than the other indices that are typically circulating, and made an effort to get as much of a relational kind of set of indicators as possible. So to capture political economy, we use a labor market structure measurement. We look at the proportion of the labor force in a different community by community, track by track, in essential occupations. And we're here borrowing kind of the ACLU's categorization of essential work. For this, instead of using an income gradient to think about class, we're using a kind of a measure that captures some sense of power relationship. We think essential worker captures working class pretty well. Seth Friend, one of our co-authors, has done a ton of work on the difference between measuring class in terms of power relations versus just as an income or education gradient. We look at housing payment as a percent of income, ownership or rent. We capture state violence by looking at the Medicaid gap in enrollment. So to what extent are people who are eligible for Medicaid not actually enrolled in it? And we look at police killings since 2013. In part thanks to our lobbying, Cori Bush and Ed Markey, a congresswoman and a senator, have included police killings in their legislation, proposed legislation for an environmental justice screening tool in the US, but generally no other comparable index has included police violence. So this would be a first. We use police killings because it's the only reliable measure of police violence that is available all across the country. Police departments don't report this to get this elsewhere. Police data isn't that great. And in terms of socio-environmental exposure, we include exposure to fossil fuel pollution. And we also invented a new measure called indoor heat islands. I'm just going to show you a few maps to show why we're using this measure of indoor heat islands. I think it illustrates the promise of creatively combining demographic and physical data. This is a map of Philadelphia that catches outdoor heat. When you read research on heat islands, that's typically what's being used, outdoor heat. The most yellow area there is the hottest, and those are also neighborhoods that were redlined. However, in the bottom half of that yellow, which is where I used to live in Philadelphia, it was an Italian-American neighborhood that was redlined. It is now completely gentrified. Has no street trees, so it's hot outside, but people have no problem keeping cool in the winter. Next slide. When we then take a different measure of electricity burden, we see something very different. We can map how much of a person's monthly income they're paying towards their electricity bill. That is a pretty good proxy for their burden of cooling their home, if they're even able. Next slide. And so when we combine a measure of electricity burden and outdoor heat, then we get what we call indoor heat islands, which we think is a much better measure, where in fact, in general, to understand environmental inequality, you always need that economic mediator. How much are people able to respond to that environmental threat? Okay, let me pass it back to Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I'm just going to talk really quick about the data a little bit more and then just jump into some results and some ideas for discussion here. So 2 of these, measures Daniel just described, we get directly from the 5-year ACS in terms of the labor market structure as well as housing costs. For the other 2 track level indicators, we rely on public information from the ACS, but here we're combining across 2 sources, the microdata at the PUMA level, which has high variable detail but low geographic detail, and the aggregate data provided at the track level, which has low variable detail but high geographic detail. And we sort of use a microsimulation framework to estimate these variables at the track level, which we describe more in this paper in sociological methodology and hopefully in our package soon. And our last 2 measures come from non-ACS sources. So as Daniel mentioned, the first is cumulative police killings since 2013 from the Mapping Police Violence Project. And so these are aggregated to zip codes, and we assign each track from any zip code boundary overlapping or adjacent to that track. And the second measure here comes from the Center for Air, Climate, and Energy Solutions, which is modeled estimates of local air pollution derived from publicly available concentration measurements from EPA monitors, as well as satellite measurements. And so basically, we just combine these 6 measures in a principal component analysis, defining the Eco-Apartheid Index as the first principle. And this represents about half the variation across these measures and is strongly negatively correlated with all the measures. And so we flip this so that a higher value on the index when we're looking at the results corresponds to a higher value on all measures. And so the outcome we're kind of focusing on and grounding this discussion is period life expectancy at birth, estimated via geocoded deaths using a combination of standard demographic methods and statistical modeling for really small samples. And happy to come back to this at the end if people are interested in discussing these life expectancy estimates themselves in some more detail. But this is all happening at the census tract level. And so we first kind of just present the linear relationship between the tract level index and tract level period life expectancy across the 20 largest metro areas in the United States. Also looking at the association with the proportion non-white residents in each tract. And so we examine the spatial distribution of the index in some of these most extreme metro areas. And then we compare to other indices like SVI in terms of its correlation with period life expectancy. And then last, we also bring in tract level cumulative mortality from COVID-19 for select cities where those data are available. So looking at the plot on the right, the predicted difference in life expectancy between the 95th and 5th percentile in the index is around 5.5 years. And the correlation with proportion non-white is about 0.45. But turning to specific cities, there's a lot of variation in these relationships. So St. Louis, Philadelphia, and Detroit have the highest predicted difference in period life expectancy. In St. Louis, the predicted difference is more than 10 years, and in Minneapolis, the correlation with percent non-white is 0.8. And here in San Francisco, these numbers are also above the national average, with a predicted difference in life expectancy of 7 years and a 0.55 correlation with percent non-white. And so next then, turning to the life expectancy correlation across different indices, we include here the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, the Area Deprivation Index from Wisconsin Center for Health Disparities Research, the EJ Screen Index of Cancer Risk from the EPA, and the whole redlining maps digitized by Richmond's Mapping Inequality Project. And there's a few things to note here. First, the correlation of period life expectancy with redlining is lower than the correlation of life expectancy with all these other indices. And as discussed earlier, this definitely does not mean redlining was not important. Rather, it just complicates the notion that the legacy of historic redlining was more about the spatial marking of specific neighborhoods, or more about codifying this broader conflation of race with risk that extended into a much broader political economy in new places. Second, the Eco-Apartheid Index is more strongly associated with life expectancy than the EJ Screen Index, and also predicts variation in life expectancy pretty similarly to these other indicators like the ADI and SVI, which have 15 and 17 variables in them. And last, we examine how our index predicts cumulative zip code level mortality from COVID-19 through January 2021, prior to the rollout of vaccines. Again, examining the predicted difference between zip codes. We estimate differences of 100 to 160 per 100,000 across these 3 cities where those data are actually provided at the neighborhood level. But in terms of COVID-19, as we've seen over and over again over the last 2 years, causal narratives around its distribution continue to be highly biomedical and individualistic. But still, the language of social determinants alone is not enough, or situating contemporary inequity in a single racist actor of the past. Rather, we need a more relational understanding of racialized power structures and the ways in which they distribute spatialized risks and privileges. So regardless of intent, characterizing health and wellness with such indices will always be political and used to uphold or not certain spheres of what is possible and effective from a policy standpoint. Characterizing place-based differences in life expectancy based on an index like this can draw attention to the key relations which are amenable to policy and drive health inequity. These relations make clear that change necessitates an interrogation of power itself, including between workers and employers, tenants and landlords, communities and violent policing, all of which are structured by the state. As Raquant argues, this demonstrates how so-called neighborhood effects are best understood as state effects, as the state produces localized inequities through disparate patterns of state violence and cycles of investment and disinvestment in particular places, including via the system of public-private partnerships. So to conclude and start some discussion on this, should policy be driven by quantitative indices like this? Of course not. Indices are helpful for describing problems and thinking about the distributional implications of policy, But such measures will always be reductionist to some degree of this complex political economy, which organizes people into place and structures projects of investment and disinvestment. But still, these indices do carry political capital, and it's clear from indices like the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index that they do drive causal narratives around the health of people and places. So indicators like the SVI, built on static social determinants like income and education, are often more politically palatable because they allow policy people to capture progressive language of vulnerability without actually pointing fingers at those actively profiting from particular policy arrangements, which make people vulnerable. And so looking ahead, this is kind of a starting point, and we have some other work in different projects with different collaborators trying to flush this out in a little more specific detail. So one example right now, I'm working with the Federal Research Data Center, looking at decomposing racialized mortality disparities over time in more of a causal framework, using linked data across some census sources and eviction court filings. Daniel has a book project he mentioned about. So this is, a really active, ongoing discussion between us. And so we'd love to hear from you guys and just hear some ideas and reactions looking forward.
Thank you. I guess I should move over so I can look at the chat. On my laptop. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Okay, we have a few questions. I think the first one is Ron's. Ron actually had a bunch of questions. Ron, do you want to go ahead and just unmute and ask your question? Ron, if you're talking, I don't think we can hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Going back to the construction of the index, I had a couple of questions. One was, what is the thinking behind the Medicaid enrollment gap as a measure of state violence? And the other is whether it might not make sense to distinguish in some way between rental costs and ownership costs as percent of income, since owners, part of what they're doing is accumulating wealth. I mean, that's sort of obvious. I don't know if there's a simple way to do that or not. That was my question. Thanks.
Maybe I can take this quickly, and then Nick can take the next question on social determinants of health. There's increasing work on the idea that inequality in social provision is a kind of violence. And environmental justice work in particular, Rod Nixon of Princeton has written a book called Slow Violence, which most people in the environmental justice world think of as a very good description of the production of environmental inequalities. So I think for us, this comes down to a broader set of literatures in social science that would think of violence as in part the kind of systematic unequal provision of benefits. And so we think about Medicaid under enrollment as really a result of starving the state. And we think of that as a form of violence. Now, one could think about putting that in a different part of the index, but we think that's defensible. On housing, Nick and I were based in Philadelphia before. We've ended up 2 different cities. And you have extremely vulnerable low-income Black homeowners in Philadelphia who can't afford to repair their homes, often can barely afford their property taxes, and are in very, very serious situations. So although it is true that a longer index with more measures could usefully break out tenants and homeowners into different categories, I think you see around the country that low-income homeowners are facing really substantial problems getting by. The wealth accumulation is not the answer to their problems. Often those homes aren't accumulating wealth. There's evidence that Black homeowners don't accumulate wealth as much as White homeowners. So we think that for the purpose of a parsimonious index, putting those 2 measures together is defensible. And once again, the goal is parsimony. That's what you try to do. We have talked about doing work where we kind of have a more elaborate set of models where we bring in more indicators, but right now parsimony is a kind of key objective.
Thank you.
Margaret, go ahead.
Hi, so I have a question and a comment. I've been doing research. My name is Magali David. I have a joint position here in Paris, and I've been doing work on mortality inequalities in the US using an index of the kind you described, but looking at the county level over a 4-year period. So, and I've also been looking at COVID in relation to this economic index. So the comment is that what we found of the relationship between COVID mortality and this index at the county level is that we really have to separate out the waves of the epidemic, because in the early waves, the large metropolitan area, especially New York, had both a low deprivation index and a high COVID-19 mortality. And then we see an emerging pattern that's more typical of the classic social determinant of health patterns throughout the 2020 and 2021. So that's my comment. My question is, one of the issues, so I completely agree with you that the lower you go geographically in terms of the scale, the more inequalities you find, which is the logical finding. The issue is that for mortality, we don't have access to data below the county level. So the study described by the CDC that was done with data from 2015 was really complicated for them to implement. They also, there is absolutely no guarantee that they will be able to get this finding. So we're left with county level data. And so how do you mentioned doing some historical work. So how do you plan to do that if you don't have access to it?
I'll say quickly, the COVID data we take only up until the start of vaccinations. That's like about a year. So it is restricted, but I take your point, one could compare it to the later waves as well. Let me throw it to Nick for the question on life expectancy.
Sorry, you got cut off a bit at the end. What was the question at the end there?
So my question is, you're unlikely to get, so you look at life expectancy at birth, but it's the same issue with other mortality or health measures in relation to your index. But you will only have that information at the census block level for that one data set from CDC. You won't have any historical data, and it's unlikely that they will produce the study in the future. So what are your plans in this respect?
Sorry, Dan. Sorry, I missed the second half of it.
Maybe I can summarize Mogley's
Yeah,
question.
sorry, I just didn't hear very well.
Not doing it correctly. So the question is, it's impossible to get more granular data on mortality, whether you're looking at life expectancy or mortality rates. And the CDC study was a complicated one to produce these estimates, and it's unlikely that they would be producing them in the future, and there also isn't historical data. So Mogley's question is sort of, what are your plans in terms of looking at these mortality statistics going forward or even historically?
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. Yeah, great question. I think it's a huge problem with surveillance of health data, both mortality and morbidity in terms of lower level stuff, outside of what's collected by local health departments. And even that CDC study of track level life expectancy, like you said, is a really complicated product and involved often in some pretty opaque ways, modeling and some parametric assumptions using, for a lot of neighborhoods, especially in big cities, it was just based on age-specific mortality from death records, but some places they kind of smoothed that using data from the ACS. And, we did some sensitivity analysis around that. But I mean, to your point, I think often in the US, we have to rely on modeled estimates for neighborhood level stuff, which is really not ideal for doing some of these things, like comparing it to other measures and making sure that, our correlations aren't just an artifact of that modeling procedure of creating mortality, morbidity estimates at a low geographic level. So I think it's a good question, an ongoing thing we're thinking about. I think, you know, part of the benefit of some of the data that are available in the census data centers are you can get geocoded individual death records based on information from the Social Security Administration instead of CDC. And so I'm working on some stuff with that, in which case you can track that stuff to neighborhood. But it's a really tough question. And I think it's a concern that like we're gonna have moving forward for sure if we want to do stuff at a really granular geographic level.
Okay, Will, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent. So thank you so much. I think it's really exciting work, and I'm really glad to see you innovating and pushing forward this literature and but also strengthening the sort of theoretical underpinning of them and ensuring that we're thinking about these in the right sort of causal way in terms of what we're putting in. I just wanted to go back to some of your framing at the beginning. And if I understood correctly, you were critiquing the social determinants of health framework as being sort of different from what you're calling this eco-apartheid framework. And I didn't fully understand what your critiques were, and I'd love for you to sharpen your discussion of what you see as the important social determinants of health, because I think it's sort of getting lost right now. I heard you saying, well, some social determinants of health focuses on sort of education and income and individual factors, but and that's sort of a straw man caricature of what the social determinants of health really looks like. And so I'm really trying to understand what the crux of the critique is.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that, Daniel, and then maybe you could jump in at the end. Yeah, definitely take your point about the critique not coming through exactly in here. I need to be sharpened a bit because I think, I think there's a big risk of creating a straw man here, like you said, where what we're trying to do is sort of differentiate the way that, social determinants of health are characterized by, public products like the CDC puts out there or in popular media, which is different than, a little more critical way of thinking about social determinants amongst academic public health people. And I think that like really the crux of what we're talking about is, I think, best described in, to me, in Nancy Krieger's book, Epi and the People's Health, where she walks through, the different sort of historical production of these different theories of disease distribution. And she makes the distinction of the social determinants framework has often been used in kind of a way that's uncritical of the power relations that distribute those things and both give them meaning. And she contrasts it with sort of the political economy framework of health, which sort of has more of a Marxist origin, and also the social medicine framework for health, that comes out of Latin America. And I think those distinctions really focused on the power and relational way of thinking about things like income and education versus they're just an individual trait way of thinking about things, which often are the parts that get pulled out and used in, popular sort of mainstream references to the social determinants of health. But I take your point for sure that's to actually land that critique might just be a whole different paper and a whole different, way of trying to frame that carefully, such that we aren't sort of pulling it in quickly here to just make kind of a straw man argument. And it doesn't quite do that critique that we're trying to do. So yeah, definitely take that point. A lot to think about there.
Go ahead, Molly.
Yes, so I think it's a really important debate because at the end, it's also a discussion about individual responsibility in terms of health and government or higher level responsibilities. And I think there is a strong relationship between initially the research on chronic disease and the individual social economic characteristics, and the fact that there is a lot of research in economics about rational decisions and individual preferences that really emphasize that kind of relationship. And I think that the work that was presented today, which is part of the growing body of literature on these issues, put I'm sorry, my English is after 7 months in France, my English is failing, but put more of the responsibility on the legal system and institution and the structural factors.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a different topic, so if you want to respond to that, sir.
Well, I'll take 1 minute, maybe, okay, Nick, do you mind just sharing the screen again and going to slide 10 with the vulnerability index, the SVI?
See that all right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. Just to highlight, like this is the index that is the most common proxy I have seen in the media for social vulnerability. And you look at what's in it. So below poverty, unemployed, income, no high school diploma. Okay, we can see why those are there. Age 65 or older, age 17 or younger, civilian with a disability, single parent household, minority speak English less than well, multi-unit structure, mobile homes, crowding, no vehicle, group quarters. I think on at least half these measures, now this might be a decent way of thinking about which neighborhood needs help if there's like a hurricane tomorrow. But if we're thinking, what is the goal of, let's say, having a multicultural United States with a lot of climate migrants who have moved here, living well in density with public transit and in well-built apartment buildings, this thing is going to fall apart. There's not a really coherent long-term causal story about the production of inequality here. So there is a discussion, the social determinants of health is a big literature, as Nick pointed out, their price we may find more and less compelling. When that turns into a quantitative index, I think that's pretty hard to defend. Whereas I would say our index is going to last much better. And in most of our scores, with maybe the exception of essential workers, you would essentially just want to drive them down. You would want to have no families paying over a third of their income in rent or housing. You would want to have no families living in an indoor heat island, et cetera, et cetera. So there is, from the complex literature down to the index that is used, there's quite a bit of slippage. And the implicit theory here, I think, is pretty hard to defend. And that's really what we're taking aim at in this paper.
So my question was about policies about climate change. And I was wondering what some of the things that you're concerned about are that might be ending up reproducing this system. In other words, I can imagine subsidies to people who own second homes on the coasts would be kind of the example would come to mind here, but I'm sure there's a lot more things like this. We're going to spend a lot of resources in our society trying to adapt to climate change. Are there some specific topics that you think are closely related to what you're talking about here, where there's going to be great injustice and also perhaps great inefficiency in how we address?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. Nick, maybe you can go to the policy implications slide. Which one was it here? 40. Yeah, so I think, a couple things stand out. One is we think that if we are going to start using sort of hybrid social environmental indicators to steer investment, redlining should not be an indicator. It's not in the California one, won't be in federal, but it is in the New York one, because again, maps of racial housing inequality for the 1930s are just going to add noise to data. So that's a problem. And we do think that police violence should be included, certainly. To get down more granular to green investment, the Biden team had initially proposed a pretty substantial amount of funding to get for urban freeway removal. Urban freeways are a major source of disproportionate pollution in Black communities. So this is not quite the way to see it, but on the fifth one, eliminating serious air pollution, prioritized BIPOC communities. So our measure of fossil fuel combustion exposure, nitrous oxide, is largely capturing traffic-related emissions. And that fund that Biden had proposed is essentially vanished. It got whittled down to almost nothing in the bipartisan infrastructure fund. And in that process also got taken out of Build Back Better, which we're still waiting to see if it will even pass. So one big issue is, are we going to actually take seriously the problem that freeways are largely built through communities of color and cities? And we should. And that would be a big part of the solution. So I think this points pretty clearly to that. And more broadly, when you look, or sorry, not maybe to say secondly, in California, cap and trade legislation has done a good job of channeling investment into communities of color. But it has not, the form that California cap and trade law has taken, has not reduced combustion of fossil fuels in communities of color. And Rachel Mello-Frosch at Berkeley and others have shown that there may have even been an increase in fossil fuel combustion in communities of color. So this measure goes right to the exposure to fossil fuel combustion. Quickly on the heat islands, indoor heat islands piece, we are seeing increasing programs around the country for things like appliance rebates, tax incentives to weatherize your homes. Virtually none of that is going to hit low-income households for a number of reasons we could get into. This is probably one of my number one areas of policy specialty is the environment, climate policy, and housing. And so again, the indoor heat island effect, that is going to take us right, that measure is going to take us right into a conversation of how do you ensure that low-income households are not differentially exposed to extreme heat? How are they going to get always safe, healthy indoor temperatures? And that's a very different policy perspective than how am I going to reduce the marginal cost for a middle or upper class homeowner to swap in electric appliances and throw on solar panels. Right now, solar panels are overwhelmingly on the homes of white families who have high FICO scores and who are homeowners. There's virtually nothing right now for greening, and in particular for improving indoor health quality and comfort for tenants and for tenants of color. So it's a really good question. And I think this index does dive right into not the entirety of climate policy debate, but certainly some of the key parts of it. And it fundamentally gets down to, will people of color be the last to benefit from a green transition, or will they benefit immediately as they are suffering the most? Well, most of the people of color and of course other working class people and indigenous peoples as well.
Great, thank you. I think we are at time. It looks like there's some good comments on chat, so we can pass that on to Nick and Daniel, so you can carry on the conversation. Thanks everyone for joining and bearing up with us as we figure out this hybrid format. Let's thank Daniel and Nick.